Hi, everybody. Welcome to the season finale of the CEBRA webinar, Inflation Drivers and Dynamics. My name is Raphael Schönle. I'm one of the organizers of this webinar series on behalf of the Central Bank Research Association and the Center for Inflation Research at the Cleveland Fed. Dominic Smith is my co-organizer. And without much ado, let me pass on the virtual stage to Hugh Montag from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, who will be today's moderator. Hugh?
Thank you, Raphael. The topics of today's sessions are nonlinearities in the regional Phillips curve with labor market tightness, and a theory of how workers keep up with inflation. I'd like to offer special thanks to the organizers, Raphael Schönle from Brandeis University and Dominic Smith from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. The way this webinar is structured is that it will be 45 minutes with two presentations of approximately 15 minutes each and about 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers at the very end. Attendees do not have the option to switch on their audio or video, but they are invited to write comments or questions in the Q&A space. Attendees can, of course, post their questions during the presentations, and they do not have to wait until the end. After both presentations, I will select questions to be answered in the Q&A portion of the webinar. This webinar is also live streamed via the CEBRA YouTube channel, and it is recorded and will be made available on the CEBRA website, www.cebra.org, and the CEBRA YouTube channel after the event. Finally, a disclaimer. Participation in a CEBRA webinar does not constitute or imply an endorsement, recommendation, or favoring endorsement of the views, opinions, products, or services of the Central Bank Research Association or any other participating institution, individual, or entity. All views expressed during a CEBRA or CEBRA co-hosted event are strictly those of the authors, discussants, and other participants, and not those of CEBRA, the co-sponsoring institutions, or any other participating institution. Without further ado, first, Giulia Gitti from the Collegio, Carlo, Alberto, and the University of Turin will present nonlinearities in the regional Phillips curve with labor market tightness. Okay.
Thank you, Hugh, for the presentation. Let me share. Okay. So first of all, thank you very much to the organizers for including my paper in this very interesting webinar series. So I'm happy to present to you today nonlinearities in the regional Phillips curve with labor market tightness. Okay. So after years of not worrying about inflation since March 2021, inflation has come back both in the US, in Europe, and all over the world. So one of the tools that macroeconomists and policymakers have to study inflation dynamics is the new Keynesian Phillips curve. According to the new Keynesian Phillips curve, the relationship between economic activity and inflation goes through the labor market because of the following mechanism. In demand-driven economic booms, workers ask for higher wages, leading firms to raise prices. So recent empirical estimates of the Phillips curve have found that the Phillips curve is linear and flat. But this linear and flat Phillips curve was estimated on periods of overall slack labor markets. While since March 2021, we have witnessed in the United States the tightest labor markets since World War II, and at the same time, an unexpected and persistent surge in inflation that reached levels not seen in 40 years. So crucially, if the Phillips curve was linear and flat, then such an enormous change in labor market conditions shouldn't have played any significant role in post-COVID inflation dynamics. So this leads us to ask whether the relationship between economic activity and inflation might be different in tight versus slack labor markets. So in this paper specifically, I ask whether the Phillips curve is nonlinear in labor market tightness, where labor market tightness is defined as the number of job vacancies per unemployed worker. However, a major challenge for studying this question using time series data is that episodes of tight labor markets at the aggregate level are very rare. And so for this reason, I turn to regional panel data, which provides me with a larger number of episodes of tight labor markets. So in this graph, you can see the simple correlation between the log of labor market tightness and core inflation across 21 US metropolitan areas from December 2000 to July 2024. So this graph is a striking evidence of a nonlinear relationship between the two variables, with the correlation being flat at low levels of tightness, and the correlation steepens at high levels of tightness. So the objective of this paper is to extract from this simple correlation the unbiased relationship between the two variables. I do so by proceeding in two steps. First, I develop a theoretical framework through which I derive a nonlinear regional Phillips curve with labor market tightness. And to do so, I add to an otherwise standard multi-sector to region New Keynesian model, search and matching frictions in the labor markets and wage rigidities. Second, I conduct an empirical exercise to estimate the nonlinear regional Phillips curve derived in the model. And first, I impute job vacancies at the metropolitan area level from state level data, and I use it to construct measures of labor market tightness across MSAs. And then I develop an empirical strategy that is based on panel variation and NIV approach. So in the interest of time, I will be very brief in the contributions of this paper to the literature. So from a theoretical point of view, this is the first paper to microfound using wage rigidities a nonlinear regional Phillips curve. While from an empirical point of view, this is the first paper to estimate a Phillips curve with three main characteristics: regional variation, nonlinearities, and labor market tightness. So let's start by showing you how I derive the nonlinear regional Phillips curve. So in a nutshell, my model is composed of two regions, I and J, belonging to the same monetary union. In each region, I have three sets of agents. I have households who have preferences over consumption and the labor force participation of their household members. The labor force is divided between workers that are attached to firms at the beginning of the period and unemployed workers who look for jobs and get hired according to a matching function. Labor is perfectly mobile across sectors, but it is immobile across regions. Then the production side of the economy is composed of three vertically linked sectors. There is a commodity good in which a commodity sector in which a commodity good is traded on international markets at an exogenous price. Then in each region, there is a representative intermediate input firm, which uses the commodity good and labor to produce under perfect competition a tradable intermediate input. And then there is a continuum of final goods firms, which use the intermediate input and labor to produce under monopolistic competition non-tradable varieties of final goods, which are consumed locally by households. So in my model, the price setters are final goods firms, and they are subject to nominal frictions a la Calvo. And moreover, labor employed by firms is divided between workers attached to firms at the beginning of the period and newly hired workers. So this implies that the labor costs relevant to the marginal cost of final goods firms depend on wages of newly hired workers and hiring costs. Then there are employment agencies, which post vacancies of intermediate input and final goods firms, paying a real cost for each vacancy posted, and they match unemployed workers to vacancies, charging a fee to firms. And to close the model, there is a monetary authority that sets a common interest rate according to a Taylor rule. So let me walk you through how I microfound the nonlinearity of the regional Phillips curve. So this is due to the wage setting mechanism. And the wage setting mechanism is constructed following Phillips' argument, the argument developed by Phillips in his 1958 paper. In that paper, Phillips observed that there was a nonlinear relationship between labor market tightness and nominal wage growth. And he argues that this was due to the fact that workers are unwilling to receive wage cuts, even if unemployment is high and labor demand is weak. But they're perfectly happy to receive wage increases. So when the labor market becomes tight, firms need to bid up wages quite rapidly in order to attract workers. So to capture Phillips' idea, I assume that wages of newly hired workers are equal to the maximum between wages of attached workers and the flexible wage rate. So I assume that wages of attached workers, so existing wages, are equal to a linear combination between the steady state level of wages and the flexible wage rate, with the weight lambda being equal to the degree of wage rigidity in the economy, while the flexible wage rate is pinned down through the model of the employment agencies, and so it is determined by labor market forces. So this allows me to model an asymmetric response of real wages of new hires to the state of the labor market. Because when labor market tightness is above a region-specific time-varying threshold, then wages of new hires are equal to the flexible wage rate, so they increase rapidly. But when labor market tightness is below the threshold, then wages of new hires are equal to the existing wages, and so they move slowly, both upward and downward. Finally, linearizing the model around the zero inflation steady state, I obtained the following regional Phillips curve. So final goods price inflation in region I in period T depends on short-run inflation expectations, labor market tightness, and three other terms. First, a search and matching shock that captures, for example, shocks to the matching efficiency of the matching function. Then on the incidence of intermediate input price on regional price level, which captures shocks, disruption to the supply chain. And finally, the final goods sector productivity shock. So here the thing to notice is that the slope of the Phillips curve when labor market tightness is below the threshold is lower than the slope of the Phillips curve when labor market tightness is above the threshold. And the difference between the two slopes is proportional to the degree of wage rigidity in the economy. So to estimate the Phillips curve derived in the model, I specify the following empirical regression. So on the left-hand side, I have the 12-month core inflation in MSA I and year-month T. On the left-hand side, I have a constant MSA fixed effects, year-quarter fixed effects, and their interaction. Then I have the log of labor market tightness and its interaction with a dummy that takes value of 1 when labor market tightness is above 1. And finally, I have the relative price of intermediate inputs measured as the ratio of the national manufacturing PPI and the MSA level CPI. So when labor market tightness is below 1, the estimated slope of the Phillips curve is equal to the coefficient on the log of labor market tightness. But when labor market tightness is above 1, the estimated slope is equal to the sum of the coefficients on the log of labor market tightness and its interaction term. So why I need an empirical strategy? I need an empirical strategy to tackle the simultaneity bias between demand and supply. Because demand shocks increase both labor market tightness and inflation, but supply shocks decrease labor market tightness and increase inflation. So failing to control for supply shocks induce a downward bias in the slope of the Phillips curve. So time-fixed effects capture everything that goes on at the aggregate level. So they capture both aggregate demand and supply shocks. But at the regional level, if we think about the lenses of the model, we know that the error term contains search and matching and final goods sector productivity shocks, and these shocks are unobservable. So to deal with them, I need an instrumental variable strategy. The IV that I propose is a shift share instrument that captures intermediate input sectors labor demand shocks. So I construct the instrument as the sum of the interaction between the 3-year growth in national employment in intermediate input industry K at time T with EKI, which is the average employment share of industry K in MSAI. So GKT measures the labor demand shock in the intermediate input industry, measured at business cycle frequency, while EKI measured the average exposure to this shock in metropolitan area I. The mechanism that the instrument exploits is the following. So suppose that there is a positive labor demand shock in the manufacturing sector at the national level. Then a manufacturing intensive city like Detroit will be more exposed to these labor demand shocks. So labor demand will increase more in Detroit with respect to other cities. Labor market tightness will increase more in Detroit, driving up wages. Since the labor market is common across sectors, this increase in wage will represent an exogenous increase in marginal costs of final goods firms, which eventually will increase prices. The identifying assumption is that on average, the cost increase is no larger in Detroit than New York. The difference is that Detroit is more exposed to the shock with respect to New York. There is a threat to the exclusion restriction, and it works as follows. So suppose that this increase in labor demand in the manufacturing sector is driven by a positive productivity shock in the manufacturing sector. So this will have a direct effect on the price of manufacturing goods that also enter the marginal costs of final goods firms, driving down inflation. But I can deal to this threat to the exogenous, to the exclusion restriction by directly controlling for the relative price of intermediate input. And finally, I instrumented the interaction term with the interaction between the instrument and the same dummy. So let me show you the Phillips curve that I estimate. So on the y-axis, I have inflation deviations measured as inflation minus all estimated controls and fixed effects. So what is left there is the variation is due to labor market tightness and the error terms. So here you can see that when labor market tightness is below 1, then the slope of the Phillips curve is not statistically different from 0. So the Phillips curve is flat. The Phillips curve is flat, but the Phillips curve steepens significantly, and the slope reaches almost 2 when the labor market tightness is above 1. So just to conclude, let me mention the policy implications of these results. So the main policy implication is that the impact of monetary policy on the economy depends on the level of labor market tightness, and especially so when labor market tightness, when labor markets become tight, and so the economy moves to the steep part of the Phillips curve, if the central bank ignores the nonlinearity, then it might let inflation increase more than expected, but at the same time, it is able to bring down inflation at a lower economic cost. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, and our next presentation is by Hassan Afrouzi, assistant professor at Columbia University. He will be presenting a theory of how workers keep up with inflation.
Thank you so much. Let me just make this full screen. All right. You should be seeing my slides and you should be hearing me, just in case. All right. Thank you so much for inviting me. Giulia set this up perfectly for me. So the way I think about it, Giulia's presentation was about from labor markets to inflation, and this paper is about inflation to the labor market. It's joint work with Andres Blanco, Andres Drenig, and Eric Hurst. So one of the key features of the recent inflationary period, as Giulia also mentioned, was that vacancy to unemployment ratio in the United States reached historically high levels. So like from 2000 to 2019, this is the path of the vacancy to unemployment ratio or aggregate market tightness. And after the inflationary period, it almost doubled. So this has led to the conventional wisdom that high vacancy to unemployment ratio is an indicator of hot labor markets, that there's too many firms chasing workers and unemployment is very low, so that's why vacancies to unemployment are going up. That's an indication of hot labor markets in our usual models, in a benchmark Keynesian model. So that's an indication that hot labor market should lead to high inflation through like a usual demand-driven channel. And that was a theory, or like a understanding behind why inflation happened in 2021. However, one issue with that story is that in our usual models, the inflationary pressure of demand shocks go through real wages. And if we look at real wages, so this is Atlanta Fed's real wage index that controls for compositional effects, etc. As inflation started, real wages fell. And considering the trend that they had before the pandemic, they still remain below that trend. Yes, wages have recovered to their initial level, but they still remain below that trend, and inflation was coincided with lower real wages. So this indicates an inflation driven by cost push shocks or supply shocks, not conventional theories, whereas the picture on the left indicates an inflation that is driven by the labor market. So how to reconcile these is the topic of this paper. So the question that we frame out of this is that why is labor market so tight after the recent surge in inflation, even though the real wages are falling? So in this paper, we're going to propose a theory that says that actually causation between the labor market flows and inflation can also go in the other direction, where inflation can drive labor market outcomes, and in particular lead to a tight labor market. In doing so, we basically ask the question of how do workers keep up with inflation when inflation erodes real wages? So that's the idea of the model. So we're going to propose a new framework with costly nominal wage renegotiation. So this is going to be a search and matching framework where nominal wages are going to be rigid on the job, and in order to negotiate their wages with their employers, workers have to pay a cost. However, sometimes they don't want to pay that cost. Maybe they want to quit. Maybe the firm finds the worker to be expensive and they want to fire them, or maybe the worker wants to find a new job to take advantage of a higher wage and a new job instead of negotiating with their employers. So this kind of a framework will lead to a situation where a change in inflation will erode real wages and cause endogenous movements in the labor market through all of these channels. So the idea of the paper is to build a model like that. Before going into the model, let me show you some motivating facts. So the gray areas in all of these figures are the inflationary period, counting from like April of 2021 to around mid-2023. Panel A, we see that layoffs after the inflationary period went down. Panel B, we see that E2E rate, meaning transition from employment to employment for workers, rose with inflation. And panel C, unemployment or UE rate, movement from unemployment to employment, did not change that much. So these are some figures to have in mind when we go to the theory. Inflation makes layoffs go down, E2E rate go up, or coincides with E2E rate going up, and UE rate staying stable. Another figure that's really interesting for us is looking at the wages of job stayers versus job changers. So the idea is that inflation makes workers to search on the job and move to new jobs. Then we must see that job changers experience a higher wage growth than job stayers, and that's indeed true in the data. In fact, if I just make a scatter plot of monthly inflation rate versus the difference between the wage increase of stayers and job changers, that has a positive correlation. The job changers experience a higher wage growth when inflation is higher, consistent with this idea that workers try to exit and go to a new job. So look, with those figures in mind, so like just to summarize, vacancy to unemployment ratio went up, layoffs went down, E2E rate went up, indicating that the churn in the labor market is going up, and the fact that job changers are experiencing a higher wage growth. I want to write a theory, and I want to have those figures and those facts to be the metric of this theory. So the model is going to be as follows. We're going to have a frictional labor market model with two additional ingredients. One, so labor search model with nominal wage stickiness in the match, and lack of commitment on the part of workers and firms. The lack of commitment on the part of workers and firms just says that when my wage is rigid and I get to a point that I don't want to participate in the match, given my current wage, my employer cannot promise me like future wage increases to keep me in the match. If the wage gets to a point that either one of us want to exit, then there's no commitment on the side of like the worker or the employer to promise future values. And that leads to endogenous separations that are either quits or layoffs. And on the job, workers can also search and just move to a new job, quit from their current job. So we're going to calibrate this model based on the patterns that we see across different types of workers. So high-income workers versus low-income workers had very different experiences in the recent inflationary period. We want to capture that through heterogeneity in the productivity of these workers that we implement in the model. But on the employer side, we're going to assume that employers are homogeneous. The goal is not to cause the goal of the project is not to explain what caused inflation. So I think that was like the topic of Giulia's kind of like presentation, that how labor market outcomes can feed back into inflation. But here we just want to say, if something is moving inflation independent of the labor market, think a cost push shock that is accommodated by monetary policy, then how would that inflation affect worker well-being and job market, labor market flows? So in the model, the time is going to be continuous. There's going to be a unit measure of workers. Every worker, when they're in a match, they're going to produce with some productivity that has an aggregate component and an idiosyncratic component. The key features that are going to allow us to match the patterns across different types of workers based on income is that when workers are unemployed, their home production is just going to be proportional to their productivity with some curvature. And the curvature is going to capture how different workers are away from their outside option. Similarly, because we see different separation rates across workers with different income, we're going to capture that with a vacancy posting cost that is proportional to productivity, again, up to some curvature. So these two curvature parameters are going to match the different parts of the income distribution and how workers behave. Then just in terms of preferences and all of that, workers are going to be either employed or unemployed. Their preferences are going to be given by how much they consume, minus the search cost if they want to like find a new job and move to a different job, minus the renegotiation costs of if I'm in a match, my wage is too low relative to my productivity, and I want to renegotiate with my employer to increase my wage. If this cost is zero, then wages are flexible, essentially. That's how you should think about that. So utility from consumption, disutility from search or renegotiation, and productivity is just going to be drawn initially from an initial distribution when the worker is born, and then evolve according to a random walk. Now, in terms of the labor market side of this, firms are going to post vacancies to hire these workers in a directed search framework where every worker shows up in a particular market. There's going to be a free entry condition that firms are indifferent between like entering each of these markets and hiring a worker. That's going to lead to the usual search and matching framework that every market is going to be indexed by the productivity and the wage of the worker. And there's going to be a matching function that, as a function of the search effort of workers and the amount of vacancies posted in that market, is going to give us the number of matches that are going to prevail in that market. And then the usual definitions of market tightness in each market, matching rates for the firms and the workers follow, which I'm not going to go into. Finally, employed workers are going to be paid based on their nominal income, and inflation is just going to be modeled as a rate of growth in the price of the competitive good. Then, so taking inflation as exogenous and just like thinking about it and the steady state as being a constant, this is going to mean that the real wage of the worker is going to erode at the rate of inflation over time. Okay. In terms of renegotiation opportunities, I said they're costly. They're going to arrive according to a Poisson in two different Poisson frameworks. One is that you can get a 2% up to 2%, let's say, free wage increase that arrives every 12 months. That's a big feature of the data. On top of that, workers are going to be able to at random times pay a fixed cost that is drawn from a random distribution and just renegotiate with their employer in terms of a wage increase that can be anything, as long as it's coming out of a Nash bargaining framework for both of those guys. So that's the model. I just went really fast because I have little time, but I'm happy to answer questions later. Now I want to study the labor market effects of inflation in a framework like this. So we're going to think about inflation as, it's constant in the steady state. So in the model, we calibrate it to 2% annual inflation. And our first exercise is going to be as follows, that at the steady state of this model, there's going to be a price level shock that's going to erode everyone's wages by the cumulative amount of inflation that we saw in 2021 to 2023. That's 13%. All that means is that everybody's real wage right after the moment that the shock hits the economy, which is an MIT shock, goes down by 13%. Okay. Now, all of these workers, so this distribution is just showing that we have a distribution of, I'm normalizing everyone's wage by their productivity. So this is a measure of markdown. So everyone's real wage just goes down by 13%. And now if this was a competitive market, then they would immediately renegotiate and go back 13% up because this was a nominal shock. However, it's a frictional labor market model with nominal rigidities. It's going to take time to do that, and workers will take different actions to adjust their wages. So this is what happens over time. A one-time shock decreases real wages by 13%. This is minus 13. And then because the search market is frictional, it's going to take time for these workers to recover their wages. So wages are going to go back to their original level before the shock, but with some persistence that is endogenously driven by the job finding rate of these guys. What's happening in the background? Well, all of the unemployed guys, they are paid in terms of utility, so their wages are not, their income has not changed. But for all the employed workers, their wages have gone down. So now they are either searching more or they're renegotiating their wages. Because they're searching more, the value of finding a worker that is currently employed increases for all of these free entry firms that want to hire workers. So they post more vacancies. And when they post more vacancies, unemployed workers are not doing anything. So unemployment is not changing. Most of the action is coming from the employed workers searching for a job. So there's a lot of new vacancies that are targeted towards employed workers. That leads to an increase in vacancies that is not compensated by a change in the unemployment that raises vacancy to unemployment ratio in the economy for everyone, and then it goes up and comes down. The other implication of this is that because the unemployment rate, these vacancies are going up for the employed, but not necessarily for the unemployed, it's also an indicator of a shift in the beverage curve, because we're no longer moving along the beverage curve. We're shifting the beverage curve essentially due to all these vacancies that are targeted to towards the new to the employed workers. So I want to relate this to the first picture that I showed you. Aggregate V to U ratio goes up, real wages go down, and then the beverage curve shifts, which are all things that we have seen in this recent period. Okay. Now, a couple of notes in terms of the mechanism. So where does the increase in vacancies come from? All the employed workers, now they find their wages to be too low. They search more for new jobs. That increases the gains from hiring these workers. So vacancies go up. So we should see that in the EE rate. That was another fact that I showed you in the beginning, that all of this search should result in higher E2E transitions, which is also happening in the model. That's another metric that I wanted to evaluate the model according to. Finally, I showed you the difference between the wage changes of job switchers versus job stayers. Well, everybody who switches, they're switching to these new jobs with higher wages, and we see that the changes in wages of job switchers dominate the changes in the wages of job stayers, which was the other metric that I wanted to evaluate the model according to. And finally, I showed you that the layoffs will go down. That's also something that comes out of this model. Why? Because when inflation erodes wages, then firms are just, this is the transfer to the firms. They are now more willing to keep the worker, even though if the worker was close to being laid off before the shock. So that's also an indicator that the fact that the model matches. Nothing happens on the U to E rate because, again, unemployed workers, they're paid in terms of utility, so they're not really being affected by inflation as much. Finally, additional historical evidence. I want to finish with this. So Going back in time and thinking about all the periods in which V/U ratio has gone up, we see the following pattern. So we think about the current, so when I started this and I was going through the presentation, I said, think about a cost push shock that's driving inflation, right? So these patterns that we see in the labor market in the model are consistent with that kind of a narrative for what's driving inflation. What else looks like that? The cost push shocks inflations of 1970s, and also the cost push shock of early 1950s after the Marshall Plan and all of that. So I'm pointing those with circles. These are all periods in which V/U ratio went up, but I'm marking them with a circle because unemployment didn't go down as much. So these are not movements along the beverage curve. These are shifts in the beverage curve. And this current period looks a lot like what was happening in 1970s and 1951. Whereas all these triangles are traditional movements along the beverage curve. V/U ratio goes up, unemployment goes down. Motivated by this, in the paper, we also run the following regressions. We ask the question that, is inflation the culprit in shifting the beverage curve in all of these periods? And what we do, we basically just run this is just a reduced form regression to just test this hypothesis. We run a regression of V/U ratio on unemployment and unemployment squared. So that's just like the beverage curve and its curvature captured. And then we ask the following question, is there any variation left in V/U that is explained by inflation? And we find strong evidence for that. So I want to finish my presentation there. The main contribution of this paper is that it proposes a new model of frictional labor market that accounts for the response to real and nominal shocks. Our main findings is that inflation can lead to a higher labor market tightness while eroding real wages, and can explain the shifts in the beverage curve of the kind that we've seen in the recent period. Thank you very much, and I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. We have some questions right now, and if anyone in the audience has any more questions, feel free to post them. One question from the audience for Giulia is that the questioner understands the appeal of choosing theta equal to unity, but can't the threshold value of theta be estimated empirically?
So thank you for the question. I didn't have enough time to show you, but yeah, I do run some robustness checks in which I select the threshold in a more data-driven way. Especially like I use the average of labor market tightness in each metropolitan area as another threshold. And also I select the threshold that within each metropolitan area maximizes the fit of the relationship between labor market tightness and core inflation. And I do find that the nonlinearity is robust to these other ways of selecting the threshold. I chose this threshold as a benchmark guided by the raw evidence that I presented at the beginning of the presentation.
Okay. We have a question for Hassan, which is, would it matter for your results if the renegotiation costs were lower in tight labor markets?
So, but quantitatively, obviously, yes. But so we calibrate this model just like taking a stance on these renegotiation costs coming from a distribution over time that is not changing. But what is really, so to the extent that the question is addressing the issue of whether lower renegotiation costs will kill the response of vacancies to unemployment ratio, no, because what's really causing, as long as the renegotiation costs are not zero, if renegotiation costs are zero, everybody who's on the job, they would just renegotiate with their employer and they'll be done. But suppose that now we have some renegotiation costs. So some workers actually opt to, instead of renegotiating, they go and search for a new job. That is the driving force that would increase the V/U ratio that will lead to a lower renegotiation cost in the framework proposed. So it would obviously mitigate the extent to which V/U ratio will go up, because now with higher V/U ratio, maybe the cost for other workers are lower, but that initial link has to happen for the negotiation cost to go down in that framework. So I think you would always see a magnitude of this, and then like we would calibrate this to match the data, so it would pin down what that elasticity is.
I have a quick follow-up question, which is that in the motivating fact you presented, it seemed like the real wages were still below trend and there was a little bit of a level gap. But in the results of the model you provided, it seems like real wages recover quite quickly to the baseline after the shock. I was wondering if your model had anything to say about why we're still below the trend and there seems to be a level difference.
Absolutely. So that's a very good question. So I think like, so in the model, we make the assumption that the wages of new hires are fully flexible. So as long as the real wage of any worker is below what it should be, there is a firm out there in the model that would hire them at their true wage. Okay? And that's what's driving the search effort of the worker, and eventually the worker will search so much that they will get eventually like an offer like that. So in a framework like that, wages and search effort should recover jointly, and their persistence should be the same. And then like when wages get there, the search effort should also get there at the same time, which is my way of interpreting your question. Now, in reality, I think at some point, due to real rigidities or strategic complementarities, the real wage or the outside or the real wage that the new hire that will be offered is not necessarily fully adjusting for inflation. There are other competitive forces that are keeping those wages below what they should be. So search effort can recover, but in presence of these kinds of real rigidities, the wages could still be below what they should be. And I think those are the mechanisms, those are the secondary mechanisms that one would put in a model like this to kind of like capture real wages still being lower than what they need to be. But that would only strengthen like this mechanism of like V2U ratio going up initially because workers want to like quit that job.
Okay. We have a couple minutes left. So I suppose if our presenters have any questions for each other, Hassan, do you have any questions you would like to pose to Giulia?
Not one that we can discuss in 2 minutes, but I was wondering like, so one of the things, Giulia, that you showed in your presentation, and feel free to just like ignore this question, was that in the model that you put forth, supply shocks cause inflation to go up, but vacancy to unemployment ratio to go down. Whereas demand shocks push them in the same direction. Now, in a I don't know how this works with the regional and stuff, but in a world that one of the implications of our theory that I'm wondering now how to like connect to work is that supply shocks can also increase V2 ratio. And it might be that like, you know, the decline in the V2 ratio that comes from the supply shock in these regional levels. I'm talking about, you're talking about differences, I'm talking about levels. So like that's kind of like I'm wondering how you think about that. I haven't really formulated very perfectly, but we can also talk about it later.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, so this is a very interesting question, like from the empirical point of view, because like so that is that could be seen like as a threat to the like another threat to the to the identification of the slope of the Phillips curve, because to identify the slope of the Phillips curve, we want variation in labor market tightness that comes only from demand shocks. So like I posed, I like in the slide, I wanted to like capture like the traditional way of seeing the simultaneity bias between demand and supply. So I mean, the instrument should should get rid of any movement in labor market tightness that comes from a supply shock, even if this supply shock has a positive effect on labor market tightness. So as long as the instrument is valid, like the identification, it's not, it still goes through, even if supply shocks can have a positive effect on labor market tightness.
Perfect, thank you.
But yeah, in the model, that would be nice to see what happens.
Okay.
And then a question for Hassan. So from an empirical point of view, can you did you check whether the increase in labor market tightness comes first, before the increase in inflation in this episode? Can you also show some descriptive evidence of this? Because I think this could be a very good way of support.
Absolutely. I think that is a really good check of these mechanisms that that whether labor market tightness is leading or lagging the current inflation. Now, in the current inflationary period, they're happening gradually. So inflation picked up gradually and labor market tightness picked up gradually, and they're kind of simultaneous. So it's really hard to kind of decide when these increases began. But a more structured way of asking that question is that an implication of our theory is that conditional on supply shocks, inflation leads the aggregate vacancy to unemployment ratio. Whereas you would expect, because of your presentation exactly, that in demand-driven periods, the relationship should be the opposite. So this is a question for the conditional responses of these two variables to shocks, which begs for time series evidence like VARs or something like that, either a structural one or just doing one with usual identification methods. That is something that we're currently thinking about doing, but we haven't done yet.
Okay. Thank you to our presenters for presenting their work and fielding our questions. And I'd like to thank everyone who attended the seminar today. This presentation will be is recorded and will be released on CEBRA's YouTube channel later. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.